What is the soul of any wargame? If you said terrain, then you're paying attention. But then that naturally leads us to ask why terrain is the soul of any wargame. And for me, it's because terrain causes decisions, and decisions are why we play wargames. If there was no terrain, there would be very few decisions, and the game would be very boring. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about terrain in Legions Imperialis. One of the great things about this game is the terrain. I think the rules are very well done for the most part, and they really contribute to the decisions-making part of the game. For the purposes of this presentation, I've divided the kinds of terrain that are present in the main Legions Imperialis rulebook into two different categories. We've got primary and secondary, and you can see those on the screen now. And the reason I've divided them into these two categories is because primary terrain is what you should probably be using in every game that you play. And secondary terrain is probably something that you should be using more sparingly, that you probably shouldn't have in every game, or at least only a few of the terrain pieces that you use in your games. And we'll talk more about that later. The other question is how big each piece of terrain should be. And this isn't really covered in the rules, but the rules do say that one large structure should be equivalent to one terrain piece. And a large structure is something roughly on the order of being about 6 by 6 inches in footprint. And so we're taking that as a rough guideline of how big a terrain piece should be. Now, hills and valleys should probably be a little bit bigger, just because they are, they're not as impactful necessarily as other kinds of terrain. So I think those should probably be a little bit bigger, maybe, a foot by a foot, something like that, just to give that sense of weight to the hills and, whatever other relief, elevation types of terrain you choose to use. So the first part of this presentation, we're going to talk about our primary types of terrain, and we're going to talk about 4 of them, and that's difficult, obstructing, structures, and relief. Difficult terrain can be anything from cracked wastelands, rubble-strewn city streets, or, as the rulebook puts it, feculent bogs. And the main effect of difficult terrain is to make movement more difficult, as the name implies. For all types of detachments other than walkers and infantry, movement is halved within any area of difficult terrain. It also provides some cover to models that are wholly within the difficult terrain. They have a -1 to hit modifier when fired upon, and they also receive a 6-up cover save. Now you can see at the bottom of the slide we have a diagram, and the green outline is the difficult terrain. We have 4 friendly vehicles occupying the difficult terrain, and 2 hostile vehicles firing on them. Now you can see that the top one is able to draw a line of sight to the vehicle indicated by the dashed red line. However, because that vehicle is wholly within the difficult terrain, it receives a -1 to hit modifier when being fired upon. It would also receive a 6+ cover save. Now, the vehicle at the bottom is not wholly within the difficult terrain, so it does not receive any benefit for being within the terrain as I described earlier. So it does not receive a -1 to hit, and it does not receive a 6-up cover save. Obstructing terrain can be anything from stretches of ruins, craters, to areas of woodland. And in many ways it follows the rules that I just described for difficult terrain with a few tweaks. And just like difficult terrain, it halves movement, except for walkers and infantry. It provides a -1 to hit for any model that is wholly within its boundary, but it provides a 5-up cover save instead of a 6-up cover save. Now, the big and most important part of obstructing terrain is that it blocks line of sight. And so any line of sight that is traced more than an inch through an area of obstructing terrain is completely blocked. And this is of infinite height. There's really no restriction on it. So it will block even line of sight for Titans or Knights. So it's very impactful on the battlefield. And as you can see in the diagram at the bottom of the slide, the top red vehicle firing on the blue vehicle, that line of sight is passing through more than an inch of that obstructing terrain, and so it is not eligible as a target for that vehicle. Now, the vehicle at the bottom, it is eligible because the line of sight is passing through less than an inch of the obstructing terrain, which of course does give the model the -1 to hit and a 5-up cover save to the target. The rules for structures are probably the most impactful and significant in the game, at least so far. Certainly they're the most involved. They vary by size and type. They're destructible, which is something that's unique in most games. And of course, this is true only of certain weapons, right? So a demolisher weapon, a wrecker weapon, Titans can all destroy a structure. Now, structures are impassable to all types of detachments, except infantry, which treat them as open terrain. Any infantry that's garrisoned receive a -2 to hit and a 4-up cover save. So infantry want to be in buildings generally, and infantry in buildings are very, very hard to shift. They also receive a +2 CAF modifier when inside a building. So they're very hard to get out of a building once they're inside. Now, structures also block line of sight as what I'm choosing to call true line of sight. So you have to be able to see the model generally in Legions Imperialis in order to fire on it. So anything that is blocked by the structure is not eligible as a target. When you're firing at a structure itself, you receive a +1 to hit. And I've sort of laid this out in the diagram at the bottom of the slide here. You can see the vehicles are firing at different targets. The top vehicle is receiving that +1 to hit the structure itself. Firing at the infantry receives a -2. And then the vehicle that is attempting to fire at the blue vehicle behind the structure cannot, because it cannot draw line of sight to the target. Relief features are the last primary type of terrain that we're going to talk about in this section of the presentation, and they represent any change in elevation, such as a hill, a ridge, a valley, a draw. Anything like that qualifies as a relief feature. And these are important because there's really no part of any place on Earth, with exceptions, of course, that really doesn't have any kind of change in elevation. So the tables that we play on are extremely flat in scale with the types of models and vehicles that are operating on them. So there should be some kind of change in elevation, and that's what these relief features apply. Now, these features are open terrain unless you add some kind of other terrain feature to them, and they block line of sight as true line of sight. So again, that just means that you have to be able to see your target in order to fire upon it. And you can see in the diagram below, we've got that laid out. So the red-brown lines indicate increased elevation, and the top red vehicle cannot fire on the blue vehicle because it is hidden behind the hill. So now we're going to move on to our secondary types of terrain that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. And these are dangerous, impassable, rivers, fords and bridges, and cliffs. Dangerous terrain includes things such as toxic sludge, lava flows, minefields, and Xenos-infested warrens. Now, any detachment that moves through dangerous terrain is going to suffer hits equal to the distance in inches of the model that moves farthest through the dangerous terrain. So as you can see at the bottom in the diagram, there are 4 vehicles in the blue detachment. The bottom vehicle has moved 5 inches through the dangerous terrain, and so at the end of its movement, that detachment is going to take 5 AP0 hits. Now, while within dangerous terrain, models do receive a -1 to be hit when fired upon, but there's no cover save like there is for difficult terrain. Impassable terrain includes such things as gigantic alien trees, towering rock formations, and valley walls. Impassable terrain, as the name suggests, blocks all movement, and it also blocks line of sight as a true piece of terrain, so it's functioning under the true line of sight rules as established in the main rulebook. Now, we all know what a river is, but in Legions Imperialis, when we put a river on the table, it needs to be placed from battlefield edge to battlefield edge, or to some other water feature, such as a lake. It is limited by the game rules to no more than 6 inches in width, and I will say that these are probably not good for pickup games just because they dominate the table so completely. The whole game is going to become focused on this river and crossing this river, so it should be used sparingly and carefully. It counts as dangerous terrain for infantry, cavalry, and walkers, and impassable to vehicles and super heavy vehicles. But it is open terrain for knights and titans. Fords are, I suppose you could call them, a subcategory of rivers. They're a part of a river that you designate at the beginning of the game, and they allow infantry, cavalry, walkers, vehicles, and super heavy vehicles to cross a river as though it were difficult terrain. It still counts as open terrain for knights and titans, so it's just a way to make passing over the river easier. It's important to come to an understanding of what size these are going to be. My guess is somewhere between maybe 1 and 2 times the width of the river is probably a good estimate. Something that might be fun is to let vanguard detachments discover fords, maybe by a leadership check or something like that. So that would give some more flexibility and make the table a little more interactive. I think if you're going to use rivers in pickup games, I would say that you should probably be able to place a ford for free. At least the player who has not placed the river should be able to place a ford for free, just to balance things out and give him the opportunity to shape the nature of the river a little bit to his advantage. Bridges are another aspect of rivers in Legions Imperialis. They are structure-like terrain pieces that span the width of a river. And again, just like a ford, I think that if you're going to use these in pickup games, these should probably be placed for free by the opposing player, just so that they have the chance to shape the river a little bit to their advantage, or to compensate for any perceived advantage that the opposing player gets by placing the river down on the table. Now, bridges count as open terrain. They have a 5-up save as a normal structure, so you're saving on 2d6, and it also has 3 wounds as standard. And I'm going to suggest that if you have a larger bridge, that you increase the wounds with the bridge size. Just so that, because if you have a big river, it's going to be very impactful on the table, and you don't want that bridge to be too fragile. Cliffs are something we don't see too often in games, but they are an interesting part of the terrain repertoire. They have a boundary, which is called the cliff face, and a cliff must be greater than or equal to 2 inches in height in order to qualify as a cliff per the game rules. Now, these cliff boundaries, or these cliff faces, are impassable to all types of detachments except infantry. However, once you're over the cliff boundary, or the cliff face, it counts as open terrain. Now, the trick here, though, when moving infantry across these cliff faces, is that the infantry has to have sufficient movement in order to get up on top of the cliff. So as you can see here on the diagram at the bottom, we have this infantry detachment that's trying to move from left to right towards the cliff face, and then it needs to move up and then onto the terrain piece itself. Now, the infantry detachment only has 5 inches of movement, but it's going to take 6 inches in order for it to move to the cliff face, and then 3 inches to move vertically up to the top of the cliff. So because it doesn't have sufficient movement to complete that, it has to stay at the bottom of the cliff face. You can't move partially up the cliff face and stay there until the next turn. It's all or nothing. Obstacles are a bit less well defined in Legions Imperialis, but these are generally things such as low walls, tank traps, or Promethean pipelines. These are the examples the rulebook gives. And these are what we might call scatter terrain. And they're not to exceed 2 inches in height or 2 inches in width. And when you move across them, it requires the height of the obstacle in inches to move over it, in addition to whatever other movements you are completing. Only scale 5 detachments can end their movement on top of an obstacle. And if you are a scale 3 or less model or detachment, if you are in base contact with the obstacle, you get a -1 to hit if you're in base contact with the obstacle, and if your line of sight, or if the line of sight from the firing unit to the target unit passes over that obstacle, you receive that -1 to hit. Additionally, models with the charge order may engage any detachment within 1 inch of the obstacle. However, you get no charge bonus. General scatter terrain isn't really covered in the rules, but I'm going to encourage you to make use of it. And in my opinion, these should be small, maybe 2-inch by 2-inch pieces of terrain, something like vehicle wrecks or old drop pods or even non-garrisonable structures. And these are just to break up any open spaces on the table and give some life and flavor to it. Again, like we talked about with Relief, there's really no such thing as the flat plain battlefield that we see when we play war games. Like, there should be stuff everywhere. It doesn't have to be dominant or powerful, but there should be things that interrupt line of sight, that complicate movement, and that just make decisions for the players. And that's what that scatter terrain provides in those interstices between the different terrain pieces. So like scatter terrain, obscuring terrain isn't really referenced explicitly in the rulebook, but it is important, and I encourage you to make use of it in your games and to consider it when you're setting up your terrain. Now, obscuring terrain is just a generic term for any terrain that is going to block line of sight to something like a knight or a titan. And if it blocks 25% of the model, it will provide a -1 to hit to the firing unit. If it blocks 50% of the model, it will provide a -2 or inflict a -2 to hit modifier on the firing model. And you can sort of see this in the diagram that I've laid out here below. So the Warlord is only obscured a little bit less than 50%, and so it only receives that -1 to hit, whereas the Knight is obscured more than 50%, so it receives that -2 to hit. Now this is important because Knights and Titans can be fragile, and more fragile than you might think. And so giving them that option to take some cover, get that increased resilience is important to the game. It means that the person who's playing those Knights and Titans has more decisions to make, like we talked about at the beginning. They have to consider where they're going to put their models, how to maneuver them to best advantage across the tabletop. And that can only improve the game experience. Alright, so now we're going to get into some maybe controversial stuff. And these are things that are not in the rules. They're my suggestions, generally just modifications of the rules as they are, but they're not official. They're food for thought. They're suggestions, ideas that I've had that I think could improve the game, that you might have fun playing with. So take them, apply them, modify them based on your judgment and experience. And we're just going to talk about some special scatter, terrain, and obstacles, and some more nuanced rules for obstructing terrain and structures. So these are some special types of scatter that I've come up with. They're unofficial again, I have to emphasize. The first one is a wire obstacle. Now this is impassable to infantry, difficult terrain to walkers, but provides no to-hit modifier. Now if this seems too strong for you, then an alternative could be to rule that infantry cannot march or charge through this obstacle. They can only advance. Tank obstacles are very similar. They're impassable to vehicles and super heavy vehicles, difficult terrain to walkers, and provide a 2-hit modifier only for infantry. Again, if this seems too strong, another option might be to rule just that vehicles and super heavy vehicles cannot march or charge through this obstacle. Minefields are our third type of special scatter terrain. These count as dangerous terrain, but at AP-1 instead of AP-0, and they strike the rear arc of any vehicle that moves over them. Walls and barricades we did see before under the generic heading for obstacles, but I'm going to suggest that these should provide a little bit more of a defensive benefit, and you can treat them as an obstacle, still give that -1 to hit, but allow them to provide a 5-up cover save. I think another fun kind of special scatter terrain would be phosphex. This would count as dangerous and obstructing terrain at AP-1. An alternative special rule that might be interesting is to allow placement of these scatter pieces of phosphex into other pieces of terrain, and based on your judgment as players, that terrain might then become dangerous itself, per the normal rules, because the phosphex has caught it on fire and made it dangerous terrain throughout the whole boundary. Now, one of the things that I don't like about the terrain rules in Legions Imperialis is how obstructing terrain is handled. Now, this doesn't always come into effect, but as written, obstructing terrain is of infinite height. And what this means is that craters, which is one of the examples that the book gives for obstructing terrain, theoretically block line of sight to a Titan. Now, to me, that doesn't make much sense, and I think it wouldn't make much sense to any reasonable person. How do we fix it? I think one option is you could assign a scale to obstructing terrain, and then line of sight is only blocked between detachments of equal or lesser scale. So you can see this laid out in the diagram below. The obstructing terrain has a scale of 2, and so it's going to block the line of sight between the scale 2 detachments, or the scale 2 vehicles you see in the middle. It would also allow the scale 2 vehicle on the left at the top to fire at the scale 3 blue vehicle at the top right. It would still provide the -1 and the cover save as it normally would, as you can see at the bottom of the diagram. And this does introduce some complexity, but I do think it is an easy way to make the obstructing terrain rules make a little bit more sense, especially for people who are using Knights and Titans, where it just really wouldn't make a lot of sense for some of these terrain pieces to completely block line of sight to and from those models. The last thing we're going to talk about is structure size. Now, as written in the rules, structure size is based on the footprint alone, and even having structure size is an optional rule. I think it's a good idea. I think giving some additional complexity to structures is not that difficult, and I think it does make things more realistic and makes things make more sense. Because, particularly now, larger structures on the table do not have any more durability or a greater garrison number than a smaller structure. So my suggestion is that you use the small, medium, and large sizes as suggested in the book, so that's 2x2, 4x4, and 6x6, and then make some accounting for height. So if you have a very tall building, maybe with a smaller footprint, that might count as a medium building. Figure out with your playgroup, what makes sense to you guys, what fits with your terrain catalog, and then just come up with some height standard for each of those types, each of those sizes of buildings. And then my suggestion is that you increase the garrison number by 1 for each step that you go up, and you multiply the wounds by some value. I've given times 1, 2, and 3 here on the chart on the right, but I think it might make sense to do that maybe to double the wounds each time you go up in size, because buildings can be very fragile. If you run 6 Leviathan dreadnoughts into a building, those siege claws have the Wrecker 2 special rule. So one of them is going to be able to completely destroy a small building in one round if it fails its save. So a large building is not going to have much better chance if it's encountering 4 or 5 or 6 Leviathan Dreadnoughts. They're just going to flatten it. So I think giving them some additional durability is a good thing. Now, again, this does add some more complexity, and you're going to have to communicate with your opponent and your playgroup and make sure that everybody's on the same page about what constitutes what and what counts for what and how you're going to play it. The advantage of the rules as they stand right now is that it's simple and easy and everybody understands what's what. So I think this suggestion is a good one, but only if you're willing to communicate with your opponent and with your playgroup and make sure that there's no room for doubt when you're playing. So, I know that was a bit of a long video. I hope it was informative and instructive. Some final thoughts. Again, Legions Imperialis has quite a few types of terrain, as we've seen. I highly suggest that you use them. There's a good variety in the rules, and I encourage you to make use of that variety in your games. Don't just have structures on the table. Don't just have difficult terrain. Have a mix. Good terrain is going to make for interesting decisions in your games, and interesting decisions are going to make for good and enjoyable games for both players. Now, in general, based on the guidance in the rulebook, I'm going to suggest that you have between 8 and 16 pieces of terrain on a 5x4 board as a general rule of thumb. And then, of course, vary that according to your taste. You may want more, you may want less, but that's a good starting point from which to adjust your expectations. So, we've talked a lot about terrain. We haven't talked at all about how to set up your table. So if you'd like to learn more about my thoughts on that subject, keep an eye on our How to Play playlist. There will be a video coming out about that very soon. So I hope to see you there. And until then, Commanders, dismissed.